It's time.
All right, you got the clicker?
I got the clicker. I have the clicker.
Bum, bum, bum.
And I can tell that people have been having a good time with it because the laser pointer part is almost dead. I did have to try that. So my name is Heather Flanagan. I wear many, many hats. Almost all of them touch on the standards development space. I do not develop standards. I cannot code myself out of what paper bag, but I understand the process, and I'm very good at helping people through it and helping groups actually stay organized and do what they need to do. For the context of this talk, my claim to fame is that I was the RFC series editor for 8 years with the IETF, IAB, IRTF, and independent submission streams.
And I'm Mike Kiser. If Heather is a wealth of knowledge, I'm the guy who kind of stumbles into the room and sees new things. So what you're going to get is a perspective of, by the way, I work for SailPoint. I'm Director of Strategy and Standards, to give you that background. A different perspective on standards development and what the process is like and what's helpful and the impact it can have.
That's right. Now, how many of you are actually work in the standard space? Many of you. How many of you want to?
Yeah, how many of you had
All right,
choice?
so a good part of this talk is not just to tell you how it all works, because many of you know. It's to give you the arguments to take back to your companies to say, no, this is why you should be paying for me to do this kind of thing.
So we are going to talk quite a bit about butterflies, which is nice at the end of a long week. How many of you have seen a movie involving time travel? Everybody, right? Invariably, what happens? Someone steps usually on a butterfly, something fragile, and the world changes, right? It's based off of a small cause, large effect system that this guy formalized. Originally, he had the beat of a butterfly's wings causing a thunderstorm someplace, which they intensified into a tornado. But the general gist, if you've ever seen, like I said, any time travel movie, the same thing applies here. A small impact, small change to an environment leads to massive consequences and massive impacts later on.
Mm-hmm. So butterflies and standards, of course, all have to start somewhere. And we're going to go through that a little bit. The where do these, where do they come from? And how can you really target that important point of having the most influence on what's going to happen? From there, we're going to take you through not just the origin story, but also the turning it into a pile of goo, which will then sort of magically form into the butterfly at the end of the day, or the standard, as the case may be.
So, butterflies. And the reason we're doing it this way is because a lot of people think the butterfly impacting something is important, but actually, I think we're here to argue that you have to go back before it's actually a butterfly. Go back to the origin story that Heather kind of mentioned. Fun fact, butterflies start as these little eggs that you can see. Obviously, this is zoomed up. That would be horrific if butterfly eggs were that large. But they deposit thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these eggs on different surfaces, right? Now, most of these do not actually long-term become a butterfly. And in general, you can say the same thing about standards. There are lots of ideas, lots of concepts, lots of, wouldn't it be great if we did X, Y, or Z? Most of them do not make it all the way. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be involved. There are a couple of ways that these ideas are discussed. My personal favorite is the Internet Identity Workshop, which takes place twice a year in Mountain View, California, in a computer museum, I guess appropriately. When I take people to that, their experience, they kind of get wide-eyed the first day, at least from my organization. What happens is it's an unconference. There are lots of ideas going around, lots of ideas being deposited, lots of people saying, I would love to do something about this. There are lots of conversations, lots of ideas put forth, like I say, and not all of them are necessarily viable. Not all of them are are going to be workable, but that's okay. The discussions in the Internet Identity Workshop and the IETF and W3C early on are just that. Not only what Justin was talking about as I walked in, where you kind of figure out what people are motivated by, but those discussions are freeing, right? There are no limits at first so that people can actually discuss potentials. And that's really what we're going to try and do with each of these stages, is kind of give you an idea of what kind of influence you can wield or how you can impact the standard or proto-standard, and then just any side bits. So here, like I said, when I take people to Internet Identity Workshop, usually they are a type A product manager or architect a lot of times. They walk in the room, they have about a day and a half of discussion, and then they come to me and they say, Mike, what are we doing here? Nothing's getting done. And I'm like, actually, there's a lot getting done. Just because you can't see a tangible product doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile discussion. You can sit and learn, but you can also discuss anything from ethics to public policy to actual standards. And so when I take those people back, and you'll find a similar challenge, that it's hard to quantify what impact you've made, what progress you've made. When I go back and I say, well, I had discussions on these 4 topics, and usually I get asked, well, okay, how far away is that from being? And I'm like, no, that's not really the point yet, right? The important point here is that if one of these eggs, these idea eggs, becomes a butterfly, I want to be involved here. If I wait to get involved and walk in the room, like in Justin's story from before, at the last minute, I've waited too long. And so explaining that concept, setting expectations for your organization, for your involvement, is an ongoing process that you may be more or less successful with.
And I would probably add one particular thing. So this is indeed the stage that's hardest in a way to justify, no, you need to let me go brainstorm with people. But a good argument to make is also the fact that, as has been pointed out, these standards are written by people, and they're implemented by people. And being here early on means that not only do you have influence over what's happening, but you actually start to know the people, which makes building the consensus later infinitely easier, so much easier. So it's not just about the technology, it's about establishing yourself in a community in order to be able to have that influence that you're going to need later on.
And last thing I'll say is I've seen multiple standards be impacted at this stage in fundamental ways. FastFed, including SCIM, for instance, was a discussion I saw take place live at Internet Identity Workshop, and those seeds were planted early on and impacted the standard later on just as a default course. So this influence can be very effective.
Indeed. But then, of course, these ideas, once they've gone through the bad idea fairy, model, and some of them sort of get put off to the side, and some actually start to move ahead a little bit more, then people start to converge and say, all right, this actually might have legs. Actually, this might have lots of legs. And it's really weird watching them because they don't seem to coordinate, and yet stuff moves. This is where working groups start to form, or community groups in the W3C have evolved and start to say, we could form a working group too. Or, the groups do come together, and a little bit more formal process is introduced to try and make sure that things continue on and you don't end up in, brainstorm iteration for the rest of your natural born days. Because while it's fun, you got to make progress. So the discussion of these ideas, you're going to consume a lot of time. And if you were in the very early stages, and even better yet, if it was your idea, you're going to have to start to get used to the idea that some people may think your baby is ugly. It's true. Because now it does get out into the world, and people do start to say, well, if I implemented it this way, this doesn't work for me. But you have that influence, you have those conversations, you had the idea, and you let it go so that other people can either poke holes in it or enrich it. Some of the things that are happening in this stage include some of the work that I'm involved in with the Federated Identity Community Group. We're kind of in the community group part 2 stage, where we're looking at how do we take this and turn it into a standard. The problem we're trying to solve is, how many of you are familiar with the whole browsers are deprecating third-party cookies? Have you actually thought about what that's going to do to your SSO and federation environment? Yes, well, I'm actually chair of the community group that's trying to figure out an API to solve for that. And it's really been interesting, and it's really been challenging in getting the voices in the room to not just say, oh, hey, this is a bad idea, this is going to break things, but to get people to actually start testing has been an interesting struggle, and it's just an ongoing effort of seeing how to manage a group to make sure that these kinds of things happen. And it's probably expensive in terms of time for companies to handle, and yet if you want to go back and, the people who just sort of groaned and said, oh God, that problem, this is absolutely the moment where you can start to say, all right, I see where we might have to pivot our customers or our product in order to be able to do something with what's coming out here.
And this is really where you start to see incentives come out into play. It's really fascinating to watch, because it's one thing to talk about the ideas and say, oh, this would be great, maybe we'll do something like this. It's a lot different for someone to write down a proposal or write down a draft and say, this is what we're moving towards, because people can be really, really attached to their ideas. And so you can have, not quite holy wars, but you start to realize who's incentivized by what's motivating them. It's a lot like if you ever did Model United Nations back as a kid, a nerd like me, then it's a very similar thing. That you know who the power players are and what they're trying to do, and you can have to think about that motivation if you're going to convince them for your proposal to get through.
I have no idea what that game is.
What?
I have no idea what that was. Moving on.
Yeah, so here the butterfly started as an egg, turned into a caterpillar, grew legs, as Heather talked about, and now it goes into that cocoon. Little known fact or widely known fact, take your pick, it actually just kind of dissolves, turns into a goopy mess of protoplasm or something, and just sits there. Looks like nothing's happening, but there's a lot of intensive work building on the inside, and that's kind of where implementation is starting. You have a draft here, and people actually start making code bases against that draft. The more open source implementations that can be had furthers the ideas along, helps people see visually what this actually means, what it can translate into, helps them build their own implementations as well. And really, this is where things start to get more and more real. This can take quite a long time. It just depends on what kind of investment from engineering and other sources each party has. Now, keep in mind that talking about ideas is easy. Writing a draft is some level of involvement and time consumption. Actually writing code against a draft is a much deeper step and much further step here.
Yeah, the catch-22 here is in terms of reward and expense, this is where it is most important for investment to happen so that we can get the standards right. And it's hardest to justify because the powers that be are like, okay, well, that's great, but when is it going to be done? Tell me when and tell me how much. And you can't at this stage, because that's what we're trying to figure out with the implementations. Companies often do not want to throw infinite amounts of money at standards development, more is the pity. But without this stage, then what's going to come out at the end will not be as good and may not be appropriate for your use case. So a lot of standards bodies, I think most standards bodies that I'm familiar with certainly do have a requirement to say, all right, well, all of that work has been brilliant, wonderful, and may even has come to consensus, but before you're actually going to call it a standard, there have to be independent implementations to show that that sucker's going to work. In the IETF, there's actually two stages of standardization, as it were. There's the proposed, there used to be three, but now there's only two. There's the proposed standard, and then there's an internet standard. You know how many internet standards there are? About 100. Not that many. There's really not that many internet standards, not that many that have actually made it all the way through the process. The getting these adopted, getting these implemented, feeding that back into really polishing and finishing the standard is sort of that long haul thing that sometimes people just go to give up. It's very sad.
Yeah, and at this point, your influence obviously is basically implementing against it, right? At this point, it's a butterfly. There are tweaks that can be made to the standard, right? But your job is twofold: to make sure that what was actually written is consistent with how things would work if you actually implemented it. And internally, you're also doing a sales job as well. You're still communicating, this is why the standard is important. This is the use case that's going to matter to the bottom line of my business, which is a struggle for some people. I get addicted to truth in terms of, oh, this is the right way to do it, this is ideal, and I'll be asked, well, how does this benefit us? Where are we going to make money off of this? And sometimes I forget about that. So it's important to remember the whole time you're saying, this is what we're driving to, this is what we're doing, and this is why, internally building that support.
Yep.
Thank you.
We're doing good time. Okay, so this was all great, fascinating. I'm sure you're riveted. But what was actually the point we were trying to make? There's a lot of different stages. They're slightly different from one standards organization to the next. I do tend to collect standards organizations like Pokemon, so I'm familiar with many of these things. But you can, the closer you are to the left, the more influence you have. The closer you are to the right, the more expensive it's actually going to be in the eyes of your company's checkbook. I think the point for this last bit, right, just all of that, the TLDR, really, the point in time to get involved is as early as you think you can get away with. That point will be expensive in terms of time, but not necessarily expensive in terms of actual money. You do not have to go to an IETF meeting to participate in the IETF. You can participate on mailing lists. You do not have to join the W3C in order to participate in a community group. You can just do that at any time as long as you're allowed to accept the IPR. Possibly the most expensive is IIW because you've got a $350 fee and travel to get there because that is something that does better in person. That is where you're going to have their most impact. Yeah. You going to get the next bullet?
Oh, yeah. Basically, you just have to be involved, right? It's a long process, but you learn quite a bit. You can steer where things are going. You learn a lot where industry players are thinking about the market and how they're moving as well. And really, you do impact, from these simple standards, you impact where movements go and what products eventually result and how customers and how people actually doing identity actually implement these use cases. And so, yeah, just be involved early and be part of the community.
And don't be scared when Google steps into the room and says, oh, we think it's going to be like this. I've seen them do that several times. Quick was fascinating when it first started. That's one of the transport protocols that's sort of taken over the world. But when it started, Google sent 30 people to sit in the room, and they weren't subtle about it. They all wore the same T-shirts, all green, so that they could all hum and do their thing to try and promote Quick. And as Justin mentioned in the last session, that's the point where the chairs and the process of the entire standards organization step up and say, okay, honey, that was cute. No. You have influence because you have implemented it, but you're letting it go now. This is no longer just yours. It is now into the process. So, they wanted to standardize it so that they could say they were following a standard, but they didn't want it changed because they were already implementing it. That the process does exist so that the smaller players can step and say, excuse me, I don't think that's actually going to work that way. And you can be that person, and that's okay. It's a fine and dandy place to be, and there is room in how the process works to help you out with that. With that.
Any questions about what we've talked about, either standards, butterflies, anything else?
Nick.
Hi, how often in practice, you talked about writing open source code to explore a standard and that's a way to test it out. How often in practice is a standard written, the back engineer from that static source code? The code's already written, that's great code, let's write a standard for it.
So the question was, how often does things sort of flip in terms of someone has written the code and then said, okay, let's make a standard for this. It's not all that rare, because sometimes that's how the engineers test out their ideas to figure out, wait, okay, I don't want to embarrass myself or my company. Does this sucker have legs? Can it actually be made to work? And it often speaks to the engineers more deeply to say, I have prototype code. I can show you how this might work. What do you think? And sometimes that's actually helpful, as opposed to just coming up with a pie-in-the-sky idea when you don't really understand what you're doing at all, which I would argue is a little bit of what happened with the FedCM API. The people that were working on it absolutely know browsers really well, but they don't know identity. And so it's been interesting to see, they're putting in code, and it's like, wait, that's actually not how SAML or OpenID Connect works. So, bringing the knowledge together to get them to change that code, change the API, and therefore change the standardization process has been critical. Other questions? Danny.
Slightly a personal standard. So the whole timeline of life cycle. So how I guess is it like the further along? Let's say that I guess specifically maybe as you get to the right side of the chart, essentially it becomes more and more solid, less malleable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of certain standards that maybe have been sitting at proposed standard for a while, but maybe there's some problems in them. But is that sort of is there room to adjust things when they're not yet internet standards, and how much?
Yes. Okay. So there's a little bit of human element happening in here. So those lines can take years, and that's exhausting. The people who actually do it just get plain old tired. And once it gets to proposed standard, in order for it to move on to internet standard, all of the errata have to be resolved. And so that's sort of where the now, is there any mechanism to change between proposed standard and internet standard? Yes, it's in the errata, because they have to account for those and resolve those. And sometimes they'll look at that and go, oh man, that means cracking it open, and that was a really contentious topic, and they will choose to leave it at proposed standard. One of the more unfortunate things about RFCs is how many people know that there are different kinds of RFCs? Right, so that was 3 people, that was good. There are informational RFCs, there are experimental RFCs, there are historic RFCs, there are best common practice RFCs, and there are the standards tracked RFCs. A bunch of different kinds. And did you know that more than one organization can actually submit RFCs? You've got the IETF, they do get by far and away the most, but you also have the Internet Architecture Board, you have the Internet Research Task Force, and you have independent submissions that can go through. So when people say, oh, it's an RFC, therefore it's a standard, that's wrong, flat out wrong. But a lot of companies put that in their tender. As long as it's an RFC, they're happy, because then it must be a standard, and that is simply not true. So, but riding on that misapprehension are the people that say, just leave it. It's got an RFC number, we're just not going to care anymore. Makes me very sad.
And is there a balance between praxis and idealism? In other words, sometimes things don't get all the way to a particular point, but the industry adopts them, and so it's a de facto standard.
Yeah.
And other times it makes it very far, and no one adopts it, and it dies in a dumpster fire. SPML. Sorry.
Schema version 1.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. All right. Yeah, no, it happens. Okay. I mean, I admit I'm a bit of a purist on this. I really wish more people understood the flavors of what's possible, because that actually gives you a little bit more fine-grained control over what you're doing and what you're implementing and what you're reading and what weight to put into it. But that's not a common state of affairs. So, and I think that brings us to time. Thank you all very much. If you want to keep talking about standards, find me, find him.